is Dr. Sahar Khamis. Welcome to my program, The Bridge, a monthly show bridging different cultures, communities, and faith traditions. Watch The Bridge on America's Voice of the Arabs Network on all social media platforms. Hello and welcome, everyone. This is your host, Dr. Sahar Khamis, and we are in another great episode of the program, The Bridge, on US Arab Radio. And I hope everyone had a delightful and blessed Eid al-Adha celebration with family and friends. My guest today is Dr. Maha Hilal. She is a social justice writer and activist. She is the author of the new book, Innocent Until Proven Muslim, and she is the founding executive director of the Muslim Counter Publics Lab. Maha, welcome to the show, and I'm really, really happy to have you as a guest. I've known you for many years. I admire your work. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Sahar, for having me today.
Awesome. Let's start with your own personal journey and what brought you to this point. I know that you had a BA in sociology, you had an MA in counseling, but then you decided to go for a PhD in justice and law. And then you decided to take this journey of really defending those who are marginalized and those who are oppressed or repressed, and especially Muslim communities. So what brought you to this particular point and what inspired your interest in this particular field?
So, I think there's a lot of things that got me to where I am today. One is just the way I was raised. Both my parents were Muslim, are Muslim, I should say. And part of what they really imparted to me as a Muslim is generosity and giving back to your community and really taking care of your community, being part of it, what being part of an ummah or Muslim community really entailed. And that is to support other Muslims. So I think that was sort of what laid the foundation in terms of where I am today. But there's a very particular experience that I had in 2007, which is when I was between the first and second year of my master's in counseling program, where I did an internship at Amnesty International in what was then called the Denounce Torture Initiative. And through that internship, I learned about Guantanamo Bay specifically, the fact that the prison housed an exclusively Muslim male population, and that they were being subjected to torture. So that experience was one of the first of many that I had that really gave me a sense of how far the US government would go to target Muslims. And in having that experience, right, as well as using that experience to learn about the history of this country, the United States, and understanding the trajectory of violence towards Muslims, beginning with the enslavement of Black Muslims, really made me want to challenge and work towards social justice in a way and through the lens of understanding and really, I think, pushing the idea that Muslim rights are categorical. They're not rights that can be negotiated. They're not rights that we should have to beg for, but they are rights that are inherent and that we deserve and have as human beings. And so to me, Guantanamo Bay again was sort of this example, one of the emblematic examples of this, and also just got me on the path of really beginning to understand, examine, and critically challenge, especially post 9/11, the war on terror and the targeting of Muslims.
Very interesting. Now, speaking about 9/11, every time the issue of Islamophobia or Islamophobic sentiments or discrimination against Islam and Muslims is raised, automatically 9/11 is mentioned. This tragic day in every sense of the word. I always think myself, again, feel free to challenge me, that 9/11 is somehow a double-edged sword. On one hand, yes, it did increase sentiments of, Islamophobia and obviously attaching horrible labels like terrorism and fundamentalism and all of that to Muslims at large. But at the same time, it increased the appetite for learning and knowing more about Islam and Muslims and the Arab world and the Middle East. I would like to hear your thoughts about this very important pivotal moments of 9/11 in particular, and the many implications it had on Muslims at large and American Muslims in particular, and whether you share my view that's actually a double-edged sword or not.
So I think that, the war on terror, obviously, that was launched after 9/11 was very destructive and catastrophic, right? In my book, I talk about this taxonomy of the war on terror, in which there are 5 dimensions. So it included and includes militarism and warfare, surveillance, draconian immigration policies, federal terrorism prosecutions, and detention and torture. And those are just some of the ways that the United States targeted Muslims. And in particular, the narrative that was constructed post 9/11 was designed and deployed to create a particular construction of Muslims and to frame Muslims as being inherently evil, barbaric, uncivilized, opposed to normative democratic values. And as a result of that, it became really difficult, and it is still difficult, to disentangle Muslims from these constructions that have been imposed upon us. And the narratives, again, that have been used from the very beginning were part of this project, because it was narratives that were created to tell the story, right, of what happened on 9/11, why it happened. And although, throughout now we're at almost 22 years of the war on terror, some of the narratives have varied, and some have, sought to separate out these, quote, Muslim terrorists from the average Muslim. The bottom line is, when you talk about a group of people and it's within a community and audience that's already primed to think of these people as a collective, then you're basically inevitably assigning collective responsibility. And that's exactly what has happened.
Yeah, I like the part about the collective responsibility. We clearly see it, for example, whenever, quote unquote, a terrorist attack is somewhere announced in the media, right? You see this immediate, knee-jerk reaction in Muslim communities. Oh, let's hope, or let's pray that this person's name is not Muhammad or Ahmed, or, and, I keep saying that it's important to acknowledge that, yes, there are some who may commit such acts, but we cannot have this kind of collective blame mentality and this kind of collective stigmatization attached to an entire group of people, the sweeping majority of whom have absolutely nothing to do with violence and even condemn such acts. But I also believe that the other maybe side of the story is that some spillover effects was created unintentionally into some kind of increased interest in learning more about Islam, Muslims, the Arab world, the Middle East, and that resulted in creating centers for Islamic studies and Arabic studies and Middle Eastern studies, although we should also say with a grain of salt that some of these centers had this quote unquote terrorism studies, lens or interest, and some of them were able to move beyond that. Some of them were not, and are still looking at this part of the world through the lens of terrorism and terrorism studies, which is, again, very unfortunate. Now, are we beyond the quote unquote war on terror era, or are we still pretty much living within the shadows of this particular challenging era of war on terror?
I think this was, obviously around the 20-year anniversary of the war on terror. The question kept being asked, is the war on terror over? And, I think that people were looking for easy answers to that question. So, on the one hand, for example, Biden theoretically ended the war in Afghanistan. Of course, that's not entirely true, as it's never true that the United States really does end wars in countries that it, has intervened in. But really what I think has happened, what I'm confident has happened, is not that the war has ended, it's that it has been so normalized that it becomes now harder to extract all of its tentacles in the ways that we live now. So whether it's, going to the airport and now we're just accustomed, right, to going through, the body scan machine, right, taking off our shoes, right, the possibility and, likelihood that we're being surveilled, for example, the self-censorship that Muslims are often dealing with because they are afraid of the repercussions of saying one thing that will be misinterpreted and they end up being targeted, for example, by the FBI. So I think in some ways, the government has managed to perhaps make it more invisible and to also instill within the American community and public that some of these measures, if not most of them, right, are necessary for our safety and security. And it doesn't matter how many times it's proved that these measures, in fact, do not increase our safety and security. Obviously, it's not just about that, it goes beyond that. So, I think that's sort of like the more empirical way of looking at it. There's another way I look at it. And this is through the lens of a congressional hearing that was on drone warfare in 2013, in which a young Pakistani boy who was 13 years old said that basically he no longer likes blue skies and that he prefers gray skies. And the reason is when there are blue skies, it's when the drones are likely to come. And to me, the fact that this young boy looks at the sky to determine what sort of violence him and his family and his community may be facing is devastating. And to me, until young children in Pakistan and all over the world no longer associate the color of the sky with the likelihood of violence by the US, the war on terror is not over.
So even 20 years after the war on terror and after it has been, quote unquote, officially declared to be over, we're still seeing the spillover effect and many lingering impacts that especially, I would say, are felt more by those who are, between brackets, quote unquote, visibly Muslim, right? Women who are wearing the traditional hijab or headscarf like me and you, maybe a young man, brown skin and a long beard or something. Those who are visibly Muslim are, of course, more likely to be, quote unquote, identified and therefore maybe be more prone to be victims of discrimination or sometimes, profiling. Now, these types of social injustices or these types of discrimination, what kind of impact do they have on, Muslims at large versus American Muslims in particular? Can we draw some kind of distinctions, differences? Obviously, there are similarities, and everything we've been talking about now in the post 9/11 and war on terror era is pretty much, a common base. But are there also some distinctions or differences that we should actually make between these two categories, Muslims at large versus American Muslims?
When I look at the trajectory of the war on terror, and I obviously have studied this for many years, including for my book. I think it was pretty solidly the case that, the war on terror initially targeted Muslims across the globe. And it did that, number one, because it was easier, right? Because, well, for one thing, they said that the terrorists that committed the 9/11 attacks were from various countries in the Arab world. Second, to target Muslims in other countries around the world was obviously much easier because there wasn't this concept of certain people have certain rights. Because when you're outside of the United States and you live in a country that's not white, the United States almost always considers you to have zero rights as it pertains to your country being bombed and your family being droned. So in the beginnings of the war on terror, it was much more focused on Muslims abroad. I think it took a little bit of narrative work, right? And this reiteration that the war on terror was succeeding to make it more possible to target American Muslims. Because when you target American Muslims, right, now you're having to deal with challenges about what rights do American Muslims have as Americans. And of course, that was a higher burden that the US government had to deal with. Now, whether or not that significantly slowed down the violence that they wanted to enact, I don't know. But again, there was that piece of the puzzle. If we look at then the community altogether, I think, unfortunately, one of the worst things that happened, right, is this idea that there are good Muslims and bad Muslims. And of course, these ideas predate the 9/11 attacks and the war on terror. But really convincing Muslims that what happens abroad does not affect them. And as American Muslims, we should sort of distance or see ourselves as different from those Muslims abroad. And the impact of that, I think, I don't know empirically what it did, but in my mind, it was done by the US government to decrease solidarity and to make American Muslims think that if they, distance themselves from those other Muslims, they would be in greater proximity to what it means to be American and what rights come with that. And I think you can look at various examples, right? I work, as you know, right, very closely with numerous survivors from Guantanamo Bay prison and have worked on closing the prison in general and ending torture for over 15 years now. And that's one of the issues that American Muslims have been almost completely absent from. And it's because of these ideas, right? Number one, about who those men are, what rights they're entailed, they're entitled to, and what is our responsibility. And whenever there's advocacy for individuals such as those at Guantanamo from American Muslims, it's usually through the lens of what this country stands for or purports to stand for, as opposed to these are our Muslim brothers who we should fight for because they've been denied our human rights. And I think that is one of the sort of, to me as a Muslim, one of the more painful consequences is this lack of solidarity and unwillingness to fight for the rights of each other.
Yeah, this point about separation or this kind of drawing a line or some kind of boundaries or borders and separation is a very painful but very interesting one as well. What about the role of these organizations are working within the United States in the area or the realm of, civil rights and human rights and social justice for, in this case, American Muslims, particularly because they're American-based organizations? Do you think that these organizations, without naming specific names, obviously, are they doing enough in terms of their mission and vision and support, or more needs to be done in terms of this particular area of working for civil rights within the United States?
I think a lot of them, again, are working through, the lens of like, we're American Muslims and we're focused on issues that are happening domestically. I mean, obviously that makes sense on many levels because they are living in this country. But on the other hand, it's quite impossible to disconnect what's happening abroad and the ways in which the United States is treating Muslims abroad from what's happening domestically. They go hand in hand.
Mm-hmm.
So
there is some kind of spillover effect.
Yeah, right, absolutely. And I think there's a lot of fear from American Muslim communities, right, to really address, at least partly. I know I'm in community with many more radical American Muslims who are more than willing and actually challenge consistently the US government. But within the mainstream sort of Muslim American space, I think there's a lot less challenging, right? It's a lot more about getting American Muslims to be accepted. And, there's often this, American Muslims will say, if you don't have a seat at the table, then you're on the menu. In my opinion, you can have a seat at the table and also be on the menu. And I think that's what has happened in many cases. You're there to rubber stamp bad policies. And so the US government can say, we met with Muslims and sort of they, gave us the green light on this policy. So I think there's a lot of ways. I mean, I know this is sort of tangential from your question, but I think there's a lot of ways in which American Muslims actually participate in perpetuating violence against both American Muslims and Muslims at large.
Yeah, if there are two takeaways, important takeaways from your last answer, Maha, I think the first one is, the idea of the need for more solidarity. And the second point is staying away from tokenism, right? We always talk sometimes about, social movements when you have, for example, even in the labor movement, in women's movements, you name it, all types of social movements, sometimes there is an element of tokenism. So it's important to stay away from tokenism and to foster and create more solidarity among, American Muslims at home and also Muslim communities globally at large. We'll come back to this very interesting and timely discussion right after this commercial break. Stay tuned, please.
When you're looking for the best in optical care, Dr. Imad Nakash is your doctor to see. With years of experience and thousands of successful procedures performed, you can trust your eyes to Dr. Imad Nakash. See Dr. Imad Nakash and his professional staff for your eye care needs. There's 2 locations to serve you. In Hazel Park, call 248-336-3937. 248-336-3937. In Rochester Hills, call 248-299-3937. That's 248-299-3937.
Get ready for an amazing experience at Ishtar Restaurant on 15 Mile Road in Sterling Heights. Enjoy excellent hospitality from owners Ali Al-Baghdadi and Fatty Bonham, serving the best in Mediterranean food. Try Chef Ali Al-Baghdadi's famous shawarma, the best Iraqi grills and food, and the best Arabic and international dishes. Dine in our authentic atmosphere or take out. Call 586-698-2585 or check us out on Facebook. Ishtar Restaurant practices all CDC guidelines and is open every day 11 a.m. to 10 p.m. Have an amazing experience today at Ishtar Restaurant, 3625 15 Mile Road, Sterling Heights.
Are you going to start a restaurant or grocery store soon? Do you need floor plans and designs? Call Naji Abood at 734-744-9796. Do you want to buy kitchen and restaurant equipment at discount prices? Call Naji Abood now, 734-744-9796. New Concept Products and Design, the trademark of kitchen equipment. 5% discount on all purchases of $75,000 or more. New Concept Products and Design, new location, 31185 Schoolcraft in Livonia. Learn more at www.newconceptproducts.com. Call Naji Abood, 734-744-9796.
Clap your hands. If you're happy and you know it and you really want to.
5-year-old Lila and her mom are on their way home from Grandma's, singing Lila's favorite song. A few blocks away, 25-year-old Dylan is visiting friends at a small party. He finishes off his last beer,
later, skater,
gets in his truck, and starts for home. Mom and Lila turn onto Maple Street.
If you're happy and you
So does Dylan.
If you're happy and you know it and you really want to show it. If you're happy and you know it, shout hooray, hooray!
Every 50 minutes in the United States, someone dies in a crash involving a driver impaired by alcohol or drugs. If you're impaired and you know it, don't drive. Drive sober. A message from the Michigan Office of Highway Safety Planning.
This is Dr. Sahar Khamis. Welcome to my program, The Bridge, a monthly show bridging different cultures, communities, and faith traditions. Watch The Bridge on America's Voice of the Arabs Network on all social media platforms. Welcome back to the show, everyone. This is your host, Dr. Sahar Khamis, and another great episode on the program, The Bridge on US Arab Radio. And my guest today is Dr. Maha Hilal. She is a well-known social activist, writer, and she is the author of the new book, Innocent Until Proven Muslim. She's also the founding executive director of the Muslim Counterpublics Lab. Maha, I really want to congratulate you on your book. And I want to know, number one, what motivated you to write this particular book? And just give our listeners and viewers a brief idea about this particular book, like a small summary or synopsis of the most important themes of the book, and obviously where they can possibly find it and purchase it.
Yeah, thank you, Sahar, for that question. So what motivated me to write the book was really a desire to underscore the fact that you cannot talk about the war on terror without simultaneously talking about institutionalized Islamophobia. Even in sort of left and progressive spaces, the targeting of Muslims has been treated as coincidental or an unintended consequence. And to me, what I really wanted to impart in this book is that it was neither. It was intentional. The war on terror was designed to target Muslims. And it did that through the narrative and through policy, as well as through convincing Muslims that it was in their interest to work against other Muslims. So I think that that's, it's really important, right? Because we're now 22 years in, right, almost, of the war on terror. And it's still not the case, right, that it's widely recognized how catastrophic the war has been for Muslims. Even when we talk about, for example, the Department of Homeland Security, which was specifically established after 9/11, that history has gotten lost. And just as a small example, right, when we talk about immigration policies post 9/11, the fact that their origins were in the targeting of Muslims tends to be erased. So for me, it was really important to write this book to underscore how, on every conceivable level, this war on terror was about targeting Muslims, whether it be American Muslims, whether it be Muslims in the Arab world, whether it's Muslims in South Asia. The point was to target Muslims, and mission accomplished, because not only did the US target Muslims, it created a blueprint from which other countries, for example, Israel, China, right, could draw from to target their own communities in the similar veins.
Very interesting. And are there particular examples or case studies that stand out in your book that you want to maybe shed some light on, Maha, to illustrate these points?
Yeah, so, let me just quick describe the structure of my book. So my book is in three parts. The first part is sort of an overview and analysis of the narratives that were designed and deployed after 9/11 to justify state violence against Muslims. And a lot of it had to do with, right, this idea that Muslims should be held collectively responsible, even if there were on occasion, right, slight distinctions being made. That no matter what the United States does or whatever violence it engages in, that it still maintains its character as a country of democracy, human rights, the rule of law, and that there are always exceptions for the US's violence. The second part really goes into what I mentioned earlier, this taxonomy of the war on terror. So looking at the ways in which the war was implemented through various dimensions. So again, militarism and warfare, surveillance, draconian immigration policies, federal terrorism prosecutions, and detention and torture. And I look in the book not only at the ways in which the war on terror was executed through these 5 dimensions, but also how they devastated Muslim communities and Muslim lives. And then the third part of the book is about two particular things. One is internalized Islamophobia and the role that internalized Islamophobia plays in Muslims perpetuating violence against themselves, and also Muslim American experiences in the war on terror. So it's meant to provide sort of this holistic picture and to look at these two kinds of Islamophobia, institutionalized and internalized, and to understand how they both reinforce each other.
Very interesting. And I'm really interested in the part about the internalized also Islamophobia. Maybe that's a blind spot. People, when they talk about Islamophobia, they talk about the media. We're going to talk about the media in a moment. Or they talk about institutionalized Islamophobia as well. The internalized Islamophobia is somehow something which is overlooked. It's understudied. It's not given enough attention. And sometimes you even see terms like, oh, the moderate Muslim. The moderate Muslim, who is the moderate Muslim and how do you make these types of distinctions and based on what? Or you describe someone as, oh, this is a fundamentalist or a borderline fundamentalist, or this person is about to be radicalized. Like when I see all of these terms and concepts, being used so, loosely, I ask myself, like, who makes these definitions?
Mm-hmm.
Who comes up with these terms and based on what? So maybe that's something that you can help us to understand in a nutshell.
I mean, I think, the terms are created to instill fear in the American public, because fear is obviously one of the most effective emotions to evoke when it comes to, trying to justify very violent tactics. So, I mean, I think it just works out in their favor. And, when it comes to internalized Islamophobia, one of the reasons I focus so heavily on it is because of all the work that has surrounded it. So, there's Frans Fanon, for example, Steve Biko, and one of my quotes from Steve Biko, who was a South African anti-apartheid activist, said, the quote that I really appreciate from him is that the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. And so again, it's about how are we participating in our own oppression? And I think for a lot of communities that are being marginalized, we're often looking externally at the ways we're being victimized by the government, by the media, by society at large. And there's a lot less emphasis on what we're doing to perpetuate that.
Very interesting. Now, congratulations again on this important new book. And how can people possibly have access to the book or purchase it if they wish?
They can go to my website, which is innocentuntilprovenmuslim.com. And there is a description of the book as well as links from where to purchase the book.
It's also available, I assume, on Amazon and other sites as well, if they wish to do so.
Yes, I think it's on Bookshop, maybe Target, a couple others.
Target and also other bookstores?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Now, another important initiative that you have undertaken, Maha, which is really also worth paying attention to and talking about, is the Muslim Counterpublics Lab. But before we talk about that, let's first define the term counterpublics. Not everybody is necessarily aware of this quote-unquote academic term. So if you can just try to simplify the term and explain what it really means to our audiences, and just maybe give an example to illustrate it, please.
Yes, for sure. So the idea of counterpublics, when I first heard it, really appealed to me. And I'll explain why in a minute, but it's based on this idea that, there is this concept of the public sphere. And the public sphere theoretically is supposed to be a democratic space where individuals in a society can come together to discuss and debate the actions of the government, among other issues. That sort of concept is interesting, but what it doesn't take into account in its sort of initial formations is that not everyone has access to that space, right? That space is by definition exclusionary because of the hierarchies and structures of oppression that exist within societies. So this counterpublic concept is about the ways in which these sort of sub communities, not as in like less value, but these communities that are being marginalized create their own discursive spaces, right? Where they can formulate their own narratives that stand in ideological opposition to the status quo. It's both a space of opposition as well as a space through which a marginalized community can come together and discuss the issues that they are facing. So you might look at Twitter, for example, right? People will talk about Muslim Twitter or Black Twitter, right? It's these areas of conversation and discourse where they're talking about specific experiences and, they're targeting perhaps without the lens necessarily, right, of what the dominant narrative is saying about a community, right? Or without filtering their experiences through this dominant discourse. So I think it's a very powerful space, and especially when you look at it as a space that is ideologically opposed to the status quo. And I think we can also see that, for example, my approach to doing this work in Islamophobia is not to convince people that Muslims have human rights, right? Or Muslims have to prove their humanity in order to be granted certain rights. And to me, Muslim rights are categorical. So it's also just creating those spaces, right, where that is just a given. It's not about negotiating our humanity. And that's often what we're called upon to do, right? It's if we do this, we'll be more human. If Muslims join the army and participate in furthering militarism and warfare, will that get us closer to the American dream? Will that get us closer to what it means to be American, right? There's always these trade-offs. And so for me, it's about rejecting those ideas.
I really like the fact that you're not just defining it as quote unquote a status of marginalization, but also a status or a place for empowerment, right? So I can be a marginalized group because of certain factors like race, ethnicity, religion, gender, you name it. But I'm also having this counter-public space to express, to oppose, to object, to express who I am, to express my identity, and to engage in very powerful discussions of empowerment and enablement. This is a very strong and very powerful definition. Now, speaking of the Muslim Counter-Publics Lab in particular, what do you envision as the mission and the vision and goals and objectives of this particular initiative?
So the mission of Muslim Counter-Publics Lab is to disrupt and subvert dehumanizing narratives that have been deployed and designed to justify state violence against Muslims. And so again, really drawing on this narrative piece in the ways in which it sanctions violence. So we have 3 programs. The first is our Narrative Power program. And through that program, we not only produce op-eds and think pieces, we are also, for example, in the fall launching a Muslim Narrative Power Fellowship. And it's to really impart this idea of a Muslim counterpublic, to impart the ways in which we need to seriously challenge the dominant discourse, so we are not always feeling called to respond to its false terms. We also have a political education and organizing program. So that's where we do a lot of the work to really not just educate the community, Muslim as well as those who are not Muslim, about the war on terror, but to also, in the lens of internalized Islamophobia, train ourselves to unlearn the harmful ideas that have been imposed upon us. And then finally is our Redressing Injustice Help Desk, which is where we specifically help survivors of state violence. And one of the initiatives through that program is a Guantanamo Survivors Fund that we helped establish last year with a group called No More Guantanamos, Witness Against Torture, and then a little later, a group called Heart. And that fund, through that fund, we raise money to provide small grants to men who have been transferred out of Guantanamo, but almost always abandoned by the US government.
Very interesting. So really, the Muslim Counter Publics Lab has many different objectives. Some of it is educational, raising awareness, also social justice, fundraising, solidarity and support, and political activism. We'll come back to this very interesting discussion right after this commercial break. Stay tuned, please.
With more than 30,000 successful in vitro fertilizations, IVF Michigan is now ranked as one of America's best fertility clinics according to Newsweek magazine. IVF Michigan fertility centers are the recognized leaders in high-quality fertility care. With locations in Bloomfield Hills and 9 other cities in Michigan and Ohio, IVF has experts in all aspects of the field. A founding member, American board-certified Dr. Nicholas Shama, is one of the leading reproductive endocrinologists in Michigan and Ohio. He has performed over 20,000 successful IVF cases, and it's helped thousands of couples fulfill their dreams of parenthood. When it's time to get personalized care from Dr. Nicholas Shama at one of America's best fertility clinics, call IVF Michigan Fertility Centers in Michigan and Ohio toll-free at 855-952-9600. 855-952-9600.
Kushat's Mediterranean Market and Shish Kebab offers a great array of your favorite Mediterranean meals. Meals range from lamb specialties, shawarma sandwiches, seafood dinners, and they offer special big trays of your favorite food, plus much more. Kushat's Mediterranean Market and Shish Kebab address is 32839 Northwestern Highway in Farmington Hills. Their phone number is 248-538-9552. That number again is 248-538-9552, and the supermarket is open from 8 a.m. to 9 p.m. Kushat's Mediterranean Market and Shish Kebab will definitely leave you satisfied.
Were you recently at the emergency room, urgent care, or at your doctor's office being told you need a hand, wrist, or elbow specialist? At the Katranji Hand Center, we offer the latest techniques in hand, wrist, and elbow care. From sports injuries to work injuries to everyday hand, wrist, and elbow problems, the specialists at Katranji Hand Center are here to get you back on track. Call us in East Lansing today at 517-332-4263 or visit us at KatranjiHandCenter.com to schedule your appointment today.
This is Dr. Sahar Khamis. Welcome to my program, The Bridge, a monthly show bridging different cultures, communities, and faith traditions. Watch The Bridge on America's Voice of the Arabs Network on all social media platforms. Welcome back to the show, everyone. This is your host, Dr. Sahar Khamis, and we have another great episode of the program, The Bridge, on US Arab Radio. My guest today is Dr. Maha Hilal. She's a social justice activist and writer, the author of the new book, Innocent Until Proven Muslim, and the founding executive director of the Muslim Counter Publics Lab. Now, Maha, June 26 marked the UN Day in support of victims of torture. But I also saw some of the newsletters and announcements coming out of Muslim Counter Publics Lab saying that this is a great thing, but obviously not every victim of torture is being actually included within this kind of umbrella of care and concern. So maybe you want to elaborate a little bit more for our audiences on what this message means coming out of Muslim Counter Publics Lab, and what populations you particularly believe are not included or not included sufficiently under this umbrella.
Yeah, that's thank you for that question. So, being that we're based in the United States, as well as trying to support survivors of U.S. state violence, what we, looked at yesterday in particular was responses from the government. So both President Biden, as well as Secretary of State Blinken released statements to commemorate this day. And in both cases, they talk about the importance of ending torture and healing survivors, but evade and basically don't mention at all victims of and survivors of U.S. state violence. So when the United States constantly talks about how much money they donate to the UN's voluntary fund for victims of torture, what they're not saying is that that's not going actually to support the U.S. its own victims. And Biden in particular talked about multiple other countries where torture is occurring, without mentioning again that torture is still a practice of the United States, and there has been no justice and accountability whatsoever for the torture it conducted post 9/11 and long before.
So, for example, in that particular case, I have to pause here and say that, former President Barack Obama, right, had made a promise at the very beginning of his presidency that Guantanamo Bay prison is going to be closed. And obviously that did not happen. It was a promise that was not kept. And we felt like there is this kind of lack of visibility of this particular group, the Guantanamo Bay prisoners. Not very many people are talking about them. Not very many people are trying to help them. Maybe you can shed a little bit of light on the efforts of Muslim Counter Publics Lab. You mentioned fundraising. Are there any other efforts, advocacy, or trying to raise concern at maybe higher levels of government about the plight of these particular group of people?
Yeah, definitely. So, one of the cases we helped with was a Yemeni survivor who is stuck in Serbia, and it took him 6 years to get a passport from the Yemen embassy. He, begged and pleaded for his passport for many years. And I got involved last year to advocate for him to get his passport through the Yemeni embassy. And so, long story short, he, thank God, got his passport last year, at the end of last year. But that was only after years of his own advocacy, his lawyer's advocacy, and then my advocacy as well, being that I was in touch with the embassy about every single week in the latter part of 2022. So that's one of the cases. Another one of the cases we're working on is of survivors who are stuck in Kazakhstan and have been there for 10 years without any legal status, without any support from the US government. And they have been asking to be sent to another country besides Yemen. They're both Yemeni. And obviously sending them back to Yemen at this point in time is not a reprieve, right? Yemen, obviously Yemenis are facing a brutal war and are facing, famine, death, all the things, unfortunate things that come with war. So those are some of the two cases we're working on. And then, we're part of larger coalitions that are doing both like policy work as well as more of the activism and advocacy work.
Very interesting. Now, I attended one event. I believe it was one of the very first events held with Muslim Counter Publics Lab. It was last year, and you had an exhibition. It was an art exhibition that used different forms of painting, video clips and other forms of art to try to communicate something to the viewers and the audience and the attendees about the plight of this particular group of people, the Guantanamo Bay prisoners. Can you talk a little bit about the importance and the role of art in terms of trying to raise awareness about these sensitive and important issues?
Yeah, definitely. So the exhibit is called Shattering Justice and Remaking the Muslim Threat. And it is a timeline of the war on terror, not just on Guantanamo, but many of the policies that have been, executed throughout. And the reason we wanted to do it through art is because there's a way in which, when you're just describing things in text, some of the sort of the pain, the suffering, the perspective can get lost. And that's not always the case, but art really brings this other form of exploration and understanding. And so when you look at the exhibit, and we're working on bringing it to other places beyond just our own events, they're sort of very visceral images. And it's really meant to communicate the war on terror through Muslim eyes. So without sort of imposing this discourse of what the US says the war on terror was, or what other people said the war on terror was, but looking specifically at the impacts of the war on terror. And so a lot of the images are very visceral, but really make people think about how targeted this community has been and everything they have suffered. We have suffered throughout the course of the last 2 decades plus.
Mm-hmm. And art is always a very powerful tool because you can communicate a lot of things through art that you cannot maybe communicate, like you said, in a text or in a written message, because it's visual, And
Yes.
people always believe what they see. They always say the power of seeing, right? And seeing
Right.
is believing. So that's a very important tool and a very important element. But speaking of seeing and seeing is believing, and as a communication scholar, communication professor, I cannot help but ask the question also about the role of the media in all of that. It is no secret that, media, especially Western media, has played a very important role in perpetuating many of these negative images and stereotypes and Islamophobic tropes about Islam and Muslims. Are you seeing any kind of shift or change, whether positively or negatively, in the direction that Western media is going to or heading at when it comes to the portrayal and representation of Muslims in general and American Muslims in particular?
So I'd have to say I don't know empirically if it has changed. I do some consulting work with an organization called Islamic Scholarship Fund. And, they track, the sort of degrees of representation within the field of media. And so it seems, from their work, right, and their, examination of this issue, that there has been more Muslim representation in the form of Muslims actually working for various media platforms and institutions. In terms of, the way that Muslims are constructed and sort of represented in media, I think I'm hesitant to say it's much better, but I think the only thing that makes it perhaps slightly better is the fact that the rhetoric of the government has been less, I think, vocal and visible to American audiences. And it's not as if it's because they don't want to target Muslims, right? It's because the war on terror has already been sold and there's less of the selling that needs to be done at this point. But so I think, the media has been, changing slightly, I would say. Yeah, I think I would say that. But, at the same time, it comes with certain, negatives, like when there is Muslim representation, it's like, what does that actually look like, right? So, there was a show called Rami. Maybe it's still on. I was never a big fan of it, honestly. But that show seemed to be like, we're just the average American family. At the same time as like, we have to engage in certain practices, particularly that character, right? To be seen as like, this is the more things we do that are consistent with American culture, the more American we become. As opposed to like, we have a different set of cultural practices and we don't need to change those in order to be seen as American.
Mm-hmm. I also think that some light at the end of the tunnel is coming from the fact that we're seeing, for a change now, a few Muslim names here and there appearing in, in the media. We have, Ayman Muhyiddin and a few others, of course, not enough, but at least a few baby steps in the right direction. And I always say we need to tell our story in our own words and to narrate our story in our own language so as not to have this story hijacked or misrepresented or mistold to others. So I think there is still a lot of room for improvement when it comes to the image and stereotypes and representations or misrepresentations of Islam and Muslims in Western media. But I think that there is some slight degree of improvement that we're also seeing that should be acknowledged as well. We'll come back to this very important discussion right after this commercial break. Stay tuned, please.
Ziyad brand. Quality products from our family to yours. Ziyad Brothers Importing offers the finest quality products, including brands like Sultan, Kraft, Nestle, Hook, Rico Picon, Dana, and many more. Ask your retailer to carry these fine products because you deserve the very best. For more information, visit our website at www.ziyad.com. That's www.ziyad.com. Ziyad, quality products from our family to yours.
At Top Rehab Physical Therapy Clinic in Dearborn, we provide effective physical therapy sessions in order to limit pain and discomfort. Top Rehab provides physical therapy care for any diagnosis prescribed by a physician, and we regularly see and treat conditions such as stroke, TMJ, fibromyalgia, sciatica, joint pain, and more. We use a variety of pain management methods, including modalities, soft tissue mobilization, and therapeutic exercise. If you're in need of physical rehabilitation or physical physical therapy, get the highest quality health care at Top Rehab. Most insurance is accepted and we're open Monday, Wednesday, and Friday 8 to 6, Tuesday and Thursday 8 to 5, and Saturday 10 till 2. Call for an appointment today at 313-846-0555. That's 313-846-0555. Choose Top Rehab Physical Therapy Clinic on Michigan Avenue in Dearborn. Life's too short to be in pain. Life for Relief and Development has now been rated as one of the best charities for humanitarian aid. Life's humanitarian projects span the globe, and Life is celebrating its 30th anniversary of providing essential life-saving aid to people and communities in 36 countries, regardless of race, color, religion, or cultural background. Where there is life, there is hope. And when disaster occurs here or around the world, including being one of the first responders to the Turkey-Syria earthquake crisis, Life for Relief and Development rushes in to provide food, medical aid, and shelter to those in need. We are looking to help the earthquake victims, and we take 0% overhead on emergency donations. So please help improve these efforts. Learn more about our involvement to help the helpless and bring hope where it's needed most, and make your tax-deductible donation to Life for Relief and Development now at lifeusa.org or call 248-424-7493. That's 248-424-7493.
This is Dr. Sahar Khamis. Welcome to my program, The Bridge, a monthly show bridging different cultures, communities, and faith traditions. Watch The Bridge on America's Voice of the Arabs Network on all social media platforms. Welcome back to the show, everyone. This is your host, Dr. Sahar Khamis, and we're having today a very important discussion with Dr. Maha Hilal, who is a social justice activist and writer. She is the author of the new book, Innocent Until Proven Muslim, and she is the founding executive director of the Muslim Counter Publics Lab. So Maha, before going to the break, we're talking about the role of the media and Western media in terms of the misrepresentation, maybe of Islam and Muslims, and the role of the media in general in this particular domain. Is there anything that you would like to add about this point?
I was kind of alluding to this in my previous answer, but, I think, of course, as we both know, we have to be careful to associate more Muslim presence in the media with a better perspective or a different construction of Muslims, because there are many Muslims who contribute to the same problematic ideas and images of Muslims. I won't name any particular ones, but that is a problem. And then the second thing I'll say is that, the way I approach narrative work is not just through stories, because I think what my sort of larger focus is on is disrupting the context in which we're telling the stories. So there's this constant theme of like, what is a terrorist? Who counts as a terrorist, right? The US government being able to define what is moral state violence. And so our work is specifically focused not just on these stories, but again, this larger context in which we tell our stories. Because if we're telling our stories in the same context in which there's this, repetition of problematic narratives, then the story gets lost in that.
Very interesting. I think you're bringing us back full circle to something we mentioned at the very beginning of our conversation, right? It was about, being on the table and being on the menu and all of that. And again, this whole idea of tokenism, in some cases, it's not about quantity, it's about quality. So trying to remind us that it's not about how many maybe Muslim anchors or writers are there in the media, although this is of course important, but it's most importantly about the kind of content and the kind of representation and the kind of discourse that they're actually presenting about Islam and Muslims, and whether this is going with the mainstream or against the mainstream or challenging the mainstream. And that's a very interesting thought. But I still want to encourage more parents to really let their children, major in journalism and communication and media, and not just become doctors and engineers, because we also need people who are in these different fields as Arab Americans and as Muslim Americans. Maha, when we look at a very troubling period like the Trump presidency, where we had Muslim travel ban 1, Muslim travel ban 2, a lot of Islamophobic rhetoric, to a very unprecedented degree in some cases, attacks on Islamic centers and mosques and women wearing the hijab and all of that. we did see some light at the end of the tunnel in the form of solidarity between Muslims and non-Muslims. I participated one time in one of the marches where I saw people from all walks of life, Blacks, Asians, Latino, members of the different communities, immigrants, Jews, Christians, you name it, coming out and raising banners and saying, this land is pretty much everybody's land. It's a land of immigrants, and we welcome our Muslim sisters and brothers. It's their land too. So how important is it to foster this kind of community engagement and this kind of interfaith solidarity between Muslims and non-Muslims and Muslims and other communities?
I think it's important, and I think that it does a lot of important work. I think, one of the pitfalls, I think, of interfaith work is the idea that the conflicts that we often are thinking about or dealing with are based purely on, religious ideology as opposed to political conflicts. And I think sometimes what happens with interfaith work is that this piece of it gets lost. And so we're not having the hard conversations that need to be had. And we're instead focusing on solidarity, which I think is a lot weaker when you're not talking about these divisions. That said, I mean, again, there is a special place for, I think, interfaith collaboration. I think it's generally, it can be a very positive thing. And I think, it provides a space through which people can connect in a different way, right? And oftentimes based on their belief that, human beings deserve dignity and rights, and that our religious traditions call us to advocate for that. So I do think it can be, a really strong force, but also just recognizing, again, these sort of pitfalls. And I think, one of the other things I'll just add quickly is that, when you look at the ways in which the war on terror has played out, as well as the origin of this country in particular, I mean, there is this theme of Christian hegemony. And I think in a lot of spaces where I've worked with Christians, that piece doesn't necessarily come out. And so when we're talking about religious freedom, right, we can't just not acknowledge Christian hegemony. It has to be part of the discussion. And that's just one example. And then the last thing I'll say is just that, I think in general, being in community with other communities is necessary to moving social justice forward. Because, I mean, as much as we say this is a land of immigrants, it's indigenous land and it belongs to the indigenous people. And so it also requires being in community with people who unfortunately are more marginalized by our marginalization and the ways in which we are, our lives are manifested in this country.
I love this very much, like the idea, like this is a very important tool if we use it correctly or we use it in the correct way, right? Acknowledging our similarities, respecting our differences, understanding the context within which we build these kinds of relationships of solidarity, and knowing what are the pitfalls, the weaknesses, and the strength, building on the strength and trying to avoid the weakness. I think this is a very important discussion. This can be the topic of a completely different program all by itself. But I'm afraid we're coming close to the end of our time for this program, Maha. And with that, I would like to end with a question about the future. You have achieved so much already, mashallah, in your career and advocacy work and justice work, and thanks for that. But what comes next? What comes next for you personally, as a writer, as an author, as an advocate, and also for the Muslim Counter Publics Lab?
So, for the Muslim Counter Publics Lab, I mean, I think, one of the things we really want to do is to build Muslim narrative power. And again, that building of that power is about creating a narrative infrastructure that centers the dignity and humanity of Muslims. It's a space where Muslim humanity, again, is not being negotiated, that we fundamentally assert and come in from a place of power. And building this fellowship out in the fall is critical to that. And throughout the years, right, we hope to really build up this cadre of Muslim narrators who can really pose a formidable challenge to the discursive spaces in which we have been forced to exist in the war on terror, and of course, long before, especially if you're a Black Muslim, for example. And then just really highlighting the work of the Guantanamo Survivors Fund and the imperative to support survivors of U.S. state violence, right? And that is because the U.S. government has largely done nothing. And so as Americans, to the extent to which that becomes salient in this context, it is up to us to pick up where the U.S. government leaves off until there's justice and accountability.
I also want to add something. Oh, sorry,
go ahead.
I just want to add something when you mentioned the Black Muslims, because Black Muslims also have their own, set of marginalization challenges and circumstances, and they compose 25% of the Muslim American community, right? So again, when we talk about experiences of marginalization, as important as everything you mentioned is, I think it's important also to look at some of the communities within the Muslim community that are not always given the same amount or same degree of, maybe a vocalization or representation. There are Latino Muslims, there are immigrant Muslims, there are imprisoned Muslims, those who are, incarcerated, are behind bars. There are the Black Muslims. I think it's also important to pay attention to all of these different experiences of marginalization within the Muslim community.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, the Muslim community is extremely homogenous, and Islamophobia impacts different communities differently because of the intersecting identities and the different constructions of these identities. So I think that's a really important point. And also because there has been this construction of who is Muslim, right? What does a Muslim look like? What does a Muslim sound like, right? And that has largely been dominated, I would say, of course, by Arabs and I think Indians and Pakistanis.
I think you meant heterogeneous, not homogeneous, and more heterogeneous, right?
Oh, yes, heterogeneous, sorry. Yes.
Yeah, definitely.
The opposite.
Definitely. So yeah, with that, I'm afraid we're coming to the end of our discussion today. We're running out of time. But again, thank you so much, Dr. Maha Hilal, for being our guest today. And thanks for all the important and brave work that you are doing. And I wish you best of luck in your future endeavors.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khamis. You're one of my favorite scholars, and I so appreciate you.
Thank you so much. And thanks to all our listeners and viewers everywhere. Stay blessed, take care, and goodbye.